Here we go again. This is another one for History 1301. Professor Tatum here to guide you through the fortunate misfortunes of Christopher Columbus. Yes, we're finally looking at you know who sailing the ocean blue in 1492. First, we'll start with some things that led up to that and look at what that led to. We'll be looking at a little context as usual, also looking into what I consider to be the fortunate misfortunes of Christopher Columbus. We'll examine why Columbus is significant, and I'm going to say he certainly is, but not for reasons that a lot of people may assume. So, in the process, I'll also dispel a lot of misconceptions about Columbus. And we'll also examine this phenomenon known as the Columbian Exchange, as well as further exploration and colonization by Europeans that occurred as a result of Columbus's fortunate misfortunes in the Americas. So, I actually want to start out by looking at Asia in the years leading up to 1492. All right, throughout the 1300s and into the 1400s, Asia was flourishing, doing very well. There was a dynasty in China known as the Ming Dynasty. It was thriving off of riches like silk, tea, spices, and China. And when I say China, I mean China dishes, pottery, like when some wealthy lady says, "Bring down the fine China for dinner tonight." The Ming also had very impressive naval fleets. They had ships much more advanced than European ships and much more capable of sailing over long distances and through rough waters. So that kind of begs the question of why did the Asians not make an effort to go colonize the Americas? Well, a couple reasons. Number one, nobody even had any clue at this point in time that the Americas were there. Maybe some people will see why moving forward, but not very widely discussed that there were these continents on the other side of the world. Secondly, they had no reason to go sailing and exploring anywhere. They were just fine with what they had. Look, they're doing well. They're all wearing silk. They're on these nice boats. They're probably eating some good food. They don't need to go looking for other resources. They've got it made. All right. We're going to understand that the reason Europeans end up in the Americas is because they're trying to tap into what the Chinese and people in other parts of Asia have here. Europe, by contrast, was struggling pretty bad by 1300s and into the 1400s. So this empire from the Middle East, known as the Ottoman Empire, had been expanding and conquering a lot of key European claims. So, for example, Constantinople, which had been the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, was conquered by the Ottoman Empire and renamed Istanbul, placed under their control. And that's just one example of several territories that are important to Europeans being conquered by the Ottomans or constantly being threatened by the Ottomans as they were expanding. Also within Europe, while there were on paper kings who ruled over big chunks of land, there'd be lords who were granted control over certain territories. They would extract labor and tribute from all the people in the areas they ruled over, and they provide them a sense of protection in return, at least in theory. And those lords would fight among one another to control various regions. There was a lot of warfare throughout Europe. At the time that all this was happening, there were also severe weather changes in Europe that were causing even more harsh conditions. There were severe freezes and flooding that led to extensive famine and increased food prices. And just about the time everybody's starving and killing each other and suffering losses from the Ottoman Empire, Europe was also plagued with the Black Death, which is, of course, that very lovely plague that swept throughout Europe, which led to all kinds of internal bleeding and swelling and would cause people's skin to turn black as they died a slow, gruesome death. Very, very devastating. Okay. Bring out your dead. So as this Black Death subsided, okay, as people were building immunities to this thing, and the population began to gradually recover from the losses that people had faced throughout the Black Death, there was a boom in overpopulation throughout Europe. And this overpopulation in a place where there's limited land space led to even more troubles for the people here, okay? Because now people were competing for land. That meant that fewer people had fewer economic opportunities because there's so many people competing for the limited resources available. And that's, of course, going to lead to more hunger. And it's also going to lead to more warfare as people are now fighting each other to try to control these resources more than ever. But by the late 1400s, a lot of the kingdoms throughout Europe, these smaller feudal kingdoms, started to realize we need to be working together, right? We're facing enough hardships as it is. We need to stop fighting each other. and start working together to protect from our common enemies and help each other flourish. So various kingdoms began forging these alliances, very commonly through marriages. The king and queen of these nations would take a much firmer hand in ruling over their entire kingdom and do the best they could to pass mandates that were beneficial to their entire kingdom. All right. And they would unite their armies together to have a much stronger army to help protect their kingdom. And this led to a lot more centralized power, right? We now had monarchs who were ruling over a lot of people and a lot of territory, having a lot of influence over much larger chunks of land and a lot more people within that land. Okay. And a lot of these monarchs in Europe who were coming to power as a result of this new unity that was occurring as nation states were being formed by merging these various kingdoms, began seeking to use their new centralized power as a means to start tapping into trade with Asia, right? Getting a hold of some of those riches that were flourishing throughout the Ming Dynasty, or maybe even within the Ottoman Empire. Clear example we can see of all this is with what's known as the Reconquista. So Reconquista is Spanish for reconquest, and that's exactly what this was. This occurred on the Iberian Peninsula, which is this peninsula in Europe where present-day Spain and Portugal now are. But like much of Europe, it was divided in this time between various smaller kingdoms. And a lot of those kingdoms had been occupied by Moorish Muslim forces who had come in and taken over. And the Reconquista was efforts from various Christian kingdoms in the region to reclaim those occupied territories and expel those Muslim Moorish forces from the peninsula. This was heavily fueled by religious fervor, and throughout the Reconquista, various groups of Muslims and Jews were either forcibly converted to Christianity, in this case, Catholicism is what was practiced in Spain, and those who refused to comply were either executed or expelled from the region. These same types of tactics would be used later down the road when Spain would colonize the Americas and encounter indigenous peoples there. They would force them to convert to Spanish Catholicism, or if they refused to do so, they would be executed or forcibly expelled from their homes. By the later years of this Reconquista, there were just a few kingdoms left here. There was the Kingdom of Portugal, then the Kingdom of Aragon over here, and the Kingdom of Castile here. Then down south, there was a kingdom called Granada. Granada was still occupied by Muslim Moorish forces. These other three kingdoms were all Christian kingdoms. But the Reconquista was really brought to an end when two of these kingdoms here were united by the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon here and Isabella from this kingdom of Castile. They married, united their forces, and used their united strength to expel the Muslim Moors from their final stronghold here in Granada. And they ended up taking over Granada and uniting the forces of not only their two kingdoms, but now the forces of Granada as well. That meant they had access to all the resources from all this area. They were collecting tribute from all the people living in all this area, and they now could unite the strength of the militaries of all this area as well, leading them to become a very powerful united nation state of Spain. Portugal kind of coexisted peacefully with them. They were another Christian kingdom who had the Pope's blessing, so they kind of left Portugal alone. Portugal agreed to coexist with this big nation of Spain here next to them. They would compete in certain ways over certain things, but for the most part, they coexisted peacefully as Christian kingdoms. Now, what is historically significant about this Reconquista? What do I really want us to understand about this? Historical significance. You'll hear that term come up a lot in this class. That's something you definitely want to be familiar with when it comes to your exams. That's going to be a key part of what I ask for on content quizzes and exams is what is the historical significance of certain terms. When we're talking about historical significance, it always refers to one of five things. So make sure you're familiar with these five things here. Write them down, do whatever you got to do. But it's always either the first to something, the last to something, led to something else, or was an example of something else, or demonstrated something else. Okay, so it's all you're looking for is one of those five things. Was it either the first to something, was it the last to something, or did it lead to something else, or was it an example of something bigger, or did it demonstrate something bigger? That's it. Don't overcomplicate it. You should be able to use those words. If you cannot use those words, you need to rethink it. And in the case of the Reconquista, we can see that it certainly led to the unified nation state of Spain, right? As these two kingdoms married together, conquered this final kingdom, they united all of this together into a single unified nation state of Spain. Furthermore, by forging this great nation state, this led to Spain's ability to begin seeking trade with Asia. Right now, they had enough wealth and power united together. They were no longer concerned with trying to conquer occupying Muslim Moorish forces. They could now reconcentrate their efforts to begin seeking access to trade with places like China and with groups like the Ottoman Empire. And we need to understand that their efforts to trade with Asia would unintentionally lead to their arrival in the Americas. We'll see how in a little bit here. For your next lecture activity, you're going to take on the role of a royal advisor for Ferdinand and Isabella here. So keep in mind, they are here in Spain. They want to make their way over here to Asia or in the East to trade. So you got a few options here. You can either have people go straight across the land to Asia. Problem there is each country you pass through, you're going to end up having to pay a very hefty tax just to travel through. And there's no telling how much profit you're going to be able to make after you pay all those taxes. And that's on the way there and on the way back. So that's very, very costly. And that's if your people make it back. All right. So you need to also consider there are bandits all along the way here who would very likely raid your caravans and quite possibly leave them out in the middle of the desert, stranded with none of their belongings. And they'll very likely die out there. Then you've spent all this money on this expedition, sending caravans out, and not even know if they're going to make it back alive or not. That's one option. Option B is to sail around Africa and get into Asia that way. Problem here, some people have tried this by this point, but there are very rough waters out here in the Atlantic Ocean. A lot of people have tried and gotten swept out to sea, never seen again. But your neighbors over here in Portugal had shown that this is quite possible. So Europe had gained all kinds of technologies and all kinds of maritime knowledge, meaning knowledge about shipbuilding, sailing, etc., from a series of religious wars known as the Crusades, in which Western European forces were fighting with Eastern Muslim forces. And in the process, they adopted a lot of the technologies and knowledge from these other Muslim Eastern forces about things like maritime technology and ship sailing. And by using that knowledge, your neighbors in Portugal had made good headway in sailing around Africa. Right, so by 1488, this guy sailing for the Portuguese, Bartolome Diaz, had already made it around the Horn of Africa to the Cape of Good Hope. So he made it a good way, showing that this is quite possible. All right, with a few more ventures, pretty likely you can make it over here to India. But again, very dangerous waters out here. There is a pretty big risk in that regard. Also, since the Portuguese are already making a headway on this, they may not be so happy to see that you're trying to copy their route and sail along their routes. They may want to tax you a little something on the way, or that could even lead to a little conflict maybe. But still, seems like it's quite possible. Maybe you can make an agreement with the Portuguese, work something out there. Other option. There's this guy who's been going around to various kingdoms in Europe yakking about this idea he has to sail around the world. His plan is to sail out west into the Atlantic Ocean, sail all the way around the globe, and then end up over here in Asia. This is a very dangerous idea. Nobody's ever done anything like this before. People get washed away just trying to sail around Africa. Yet this guy is talking about going way out into the Atlantic around the world. You have no ideas of what kinds of waters he's going to be encountering out here. Furthermore, people have by this point tried to estimate just how long of a distance that would be, but nobody knows for sure. He could, for all we know, underestimate the size of the earth, wind up stuck out at sea with no supplies and no food, and end up dying out at sea. And then with that in mind, you've already sponsored this voyage. You paid for this voyage to go out there, and now they've died at sea. You're not getting any of that money back. So those are your three main options here. Consider which of these you would advise Ferdinand and Isabella. In a minute here, you'll go ahead and pause and respond to the questions for the lecture activity. All I'm looking for here is for you to write 1 to 3 complete sentences saying which route you think is the safest for Ferdinand and Isabella to take to get to Asia. I'm not going to grade you based on which response you choose. I'm going to grade you on simply using the evidence I provided here, the potential downsides, and use that to make your analysis of what you think is the best. As long as you provide a solid analysis in 1 to 3 complete sentences in your own words, you're going to get credit. All we're doing here is practicing looking at evidence, evaluating the evidence, and putting our interpretation of that evidence into writing. Okay. Your response should look something like, considering the dangerous waters and sailing around Africa and the potential dangers and costs of traveling by land to Asia, the best route would be to sail around the globe. Okay. Or you could say, considering the uncertainty of sailing around the globe and the dangers of the waters sailing around Africa, it is best to travel to Asia by land, despite the great costs and potential dangers there. Or something like, considering the uncertainty of sailing around the world and the potential costs and dangers of traveling to Asia by land, the best bet is to get to Asia by sailing around Africa. Okay, just something very simple, straightforward, 1 to 3 sentences explaining your interpretation and briefly why you consider that to be the best option. All right. Please, though, avoid using what we call personal pronouns, words like I, you, me, and we. You don't need to say, in my opinion, I believe, all right? Ferdinand and Isabella are putting a lot of faith in you. They have hired you as a royal advisor. They know this is your opinion. Write with confidence, okay? Let them know this is the best way based on the evidence. You don't have to tell them what you believe, what you think. Just say, this is the best way because, all right? And explain why, all right? That's simple. Don't overthink this. Knock it out and jump back on here. Go ahead and pause now. Okay, welcome on back. So the way I would choose would not be the way Spain went with. I would have followed the Portuguese route here and sailed around Africa, made my way to India. Not only does that seem to be the safest route, Portuguese are making some progress there, but people are familiar with the coastline of Africa, so it's not like you're just taking a big chance the way you would if you sail out into the great unknown. Furthermore, Spain could be getting some riches along the way. All right, they really treasured a lot of valuable resources that were here in Africa, things such as salt. A lot of African kingdoms were also dabbling in the slave trade. So Spain also likely could have acquired some human subjects as well to use as an enslaved labor force. That is not something I would ever advocate, but that's something that the Spanish very much would be interested in this time period. So all in all, best route just seems to be going around Africa. But that's not what the Spanish did. The Spanish allowed themselves to be swayed by this guy here, Christopher Columbus. So Columbus's plan was to sail out to the west, go around the world, and get to the east. He had proposed this idea to multiple kings and queens in Europe, and they all shut him down and said, "You're wasting our time, go away." And when he proposed this to Isabella and Ferdinand got pretty pissed. He said, "Who are you to waste my time? Who are you to make such a foolish request for money to sponsor a voyage? Who are you to demand this money and support from the King of Spain? You should be here offering me support." And Columbus said, "I am, man. I'm trying to find your riches. Please don't hurt me." And Isabella said, hold on. Excuse us for a minute, sir. Honey, come over here. I need to talk to you. Calm down. Now, I understand. You're upset. This guy does seem like an idiot, and he's taking a big chance there. But what do we got to lose? What if we give him a little money? And then there goes Ferdinand steaming again. Money, but I'm not giving him any money. Blah, 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 blah. Honey, calm down. Listen to what I'm saying. We give him a little money. I know. Most likely he's going to go out there and die. Okay. But what if, just what if he comes across some kind of islands with some valuable riches, or if he finds some kind of easy to navigate waters, or if he finds something out there that might benefit us. Hell, he may even throw a net in the water and catch some fish that nobody's ever seen before. That could be very valuable to us. There are all kinds of potential gains we could get out of this. Most likely he's going to die, but what do we really got to lose compared to what we could potentially gain? And Ferdinand was not crazy about this idea, but he knew that in his kingdom, if Isabella wasn't happy, wasn't nobody happy. So he said, okay, whatever you say, honey, very begrudgingly. And they agreed to sponsor Columbus's voyage. They went ahead and funded him and provided him with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, and he headed off on his voyage to try to get access to Asia by sailing off west, going around the globe, and winding up in the east. Columbus had some major flaws in his plan, though, as we now know. Number 1, he missed the fact that the Americas were right in between him and Asia. There are these 2 huge land masses completely blocking his route, all right? He's traveling from over here in Europe, trying to get all the way around over here to Asia. Smack in between lies North and South America. So he's not going to make it. Furthermore, I consider that to be his fortunate misfortune, all right? He wound it up where he didn't mean to, but that worked to his advantage because we can tell based on the maps he was using that he had, in fact, greatly underestimated the size of the Earth, all right? He thought it was about a third smaller than it actually was. So if the Americas had not been here, and he had not landed where he did, he would have wound up out of food and out of supplies out at sea, and him and his men would have died. So it was very much a fortunate misfortune for him to accidentally arrive in the Americas. So Columbus's theory, he landed here in the Caribbean on a series of islands, but based on his genius idea here, he had believed that he had made it around the world and arrived here in some islands right outside of India, okay? He was actually here in the Caribbean, right outside of North America. But because he assumed he was in islands outside of India, he started referring to the people he encountered as Indians. Hate to be the one to break it to you, buddy. You're on the completely wrong side of the world, dude. All right, so why is Columbus so significant? Well, that's easy, right? He discovered the Earth was not flat. No! I am sorry if you, as me, were told at any point by anybody in earlier education that this is the case. No, Columbus did not discover the world was flat. I'm hoping by now this is being rectified in earlier levels of education, but when I was in school, this is certainly something we were told, and it is just flat wrong. See what I did there? Way back in ancient Greece, long before Columbus was born, there were ancient Greek philosophers and mathematicians, people like Aristotle, Eratosthenes, Pythagoras, and others already trying to do things like calculate the size of the earth. You know, they were very, very well aware that the world was round. And this is hundreds of years before Columbus was born. All right. So, nope, did not discover the world was not flat, did not discover it was round. Scratch that one off the list. Well, who cares? Who cares? Because he's the one who discovered what would become the good old US of A, God's greatest nation on earth, right? America. No. Let's take a look at where Columbus's voyages led him to. He traveled all around the Caribbean, landed in some islands here. Don't see him making any progress getting toward mainland North America or toward what we here would consider the United States of America later down the road. The first European explorer known to have set foot in the present-day United States was the Spanish explorer named Juan Ponce de Leon, who landed in Florida and established the settlement of St. Augustine, which still stands to this day. Furthermore, did Columbus really discover anything? Remember, there were already multitudes of people well settled in this land by the time he arrived, with their long histories, different ways of survival, etc. We looked at that in an earlier lecture. So, not very accurate to say he discovered anything, let alone the United States of America, which he didn't even set foot in. Well, okay, now we're just sitting here splitting hairs. He was the first European to come to the Americas, right? That's worth something. No. Hundreds of years before Columbus was born, we have records showing us that a Viking named Leif Erikson made his way from Greenland, where he was hanging out with his dad, who was on the run from the law, and came and established a colony known as Vinland here in Newfoundland, which is up in Canada, right? So he'd already been in North America, settled there. And you may be wondering, well, then why didn't more Europeans try to come once he came? Because he recorded this in his diary, his journal, his own personal memoirs. But again, he's a Viking. He's kind of out on the run, going from place to place. So number one, he wasn't planning on settling here long term. This is just kind of a temporary settlement until he can move on to the next spot. Secondly, a Viking who's on the run like that isn't going to be in a big rush to go back to Europe and say, hey guys, guess what? I found this place y'all should all go check out. So that kind of begs the question, are there more settlements that we just haven't found yet or just don't understand what they are? How far in did these Vikings possibly go? I'm getting a little carried away here, but we know for sure there were long before Columbus ever went sailing the ocean blue, some Europeans who had been in North America. And if you're wondering where you've heard the name Leif Erikson, it's most likely from SpongeBob. Okay, so I've scratched all these reasons off the list why Columbus is not significant, but I'm not going to sit here and say that he has no true significance. So why is he so important? Where can we give this guy some credit? Well, I mean, I guess we could give him credit for being an enslaver, for leading to all kinds of downfall for indigenous peoples, but those things aside, we can say he was significant for two main reasons. His fortunate misfortunes, as I called them, led to the start of what we refer to as the Columbian Exchange. Furthermore, his voyages led to further European exploration and colonization in the Americas. So if you ever have to define, I don't know, say in an exam where you're writing an ID term about Christopher Columbus and you need to write about why he's historically significant, these are the kinds of things I'd like to see. So maybe write those down. So what is this Columbian Exchange I'm talking about? We can see this as an exchange of plants, animals, microbes, and ideas between the Americas and other parts of the world, such as Europe, Africa, and Asia. All right. Some people use this same definition, but they'll say that the exchange is between the old world and the new world. But I think I made it clear that I am not quite on board with that terminology. We need to understand this is a pretty simple definition, but it has a very complex undertone. Okay. We could really sit here for several lectures breaking down the Columbian Exchange and its impacts and ramifications. Let's look at a few examples. All right, we'll start with something real light, modern Italian food. I don't know about you guys, but I love me some Italian food, whether it's ziti or spaghetti or manicotti or lasagna, pizza. What do all these things have? Right, and this is not all Italian food, of course, but most Italian food has some kind of tomato base, right? Whether it's tomato sauce or fresh tomatoes. But tomatoes were not available in Italy until after Europeans began coming and getting them from the Americas and taking them back to Europe. So while tomatoes are now a staple to Italian food, they are truly from the Americas. So anytime you're munching on a bowl of spaghetti or eating a slice of pizza, you can recognize that you're indulging in a benefit made possible by this Columbian Exchange. Okay, we can look at another example also with food that has some heavier ramifications. If we examine the Irish potato. As an Irishman, I know we have two stereotypes. We love potatoes and we love to drink. And boy, do we love both. I will confirm both of those, okay? But in Ireland, people became so heavily dependent on the potato for basic survival that when there was a mass famine in the 19th century and the potato began to die off and people couldn't grow potatoes, it led to mass starvation and famine throughout the country. And a lot of people began to flee Ireland, coming to places like the United States to escape that famine. This shows us just how intensely dependent they had become on the potato. All right. But this potato, we need to understand, which is such a staple to Irish culture and the means of survival for Irish people, was again native to the Americas and not brought to Europe until after Europeans had began colonizing the Americas and started taking them back. Very much a product of the Columbian Exchange. All right, so far we've seen mostly positive benefits of the Columbian Exchange. Brings us some good tasty food, helps people survive, but it does also make people so dependent on certain types of food that they start starving when they don't have it. But there are some very negative impacts of the Columbian Exchange as well. Okay, so for example, we can see there was a spread of smallpox and other diseases from Europe, Africa, and Asia over here to the Americas. And this disease was devastating to the native populations of the Americas. Indigenous peoples died in masses from European diseases such as smallpox. And I want us to understand here, the reason for this is not that there was any kind of inherent weakness in the biological systems of indigenous peoples. This is simply because they had never been exposed to these diseases. Remember, we saw that Europeans had been dying in masse from things like the Black Death and all kinds of other diseases during the Dark Ages before they began colonizing the Americas. And they'd had hundreds of years to build up immunities to all this. All right. It's just the fact that these native peoples have never been exposed to this, and now they're getting it for the first time. Kind of like when COVID first broke out, nobody's bodies had immunity to this. Nobody's bodies knew how to handle this, and it was very deadly to all kinds of people, especially the most vulnerable within our societies, as it was here. It's also very important for us to not overstate the impacts of this disease spread on the rapid decline in Native American population during the colonial period and even into the early years of the United States. There are several other aspects of colonialism that contributed to this that we definitely need to make sure to be mindful of. All right, things like enslaving masses of Native Americans and working them in some cases quite literally to death, or putting them in very dangerous conditions that would later lead to their deaths. Things like overworking them in Spanish silver mines or in sugar fields in the Caribbean. Also, a lot of these people were killed by warfare uh, or just by murder from settler colonialists who wanted to come move into their territory. So there's all kinds of impacts at play, and we need to make sure that we're not just kind of distancing that responsibility from the colonizers by saying, "Oh, this downfall was all mostly a spread of disease to these people who could not handle the superior European disease." We need to definitely be mindful of the fact that there were all kinds of actions taken by human beings that contributed to this just as much. Right? There's also evidence that suggests that some of this disease spread may have not been so accidental. Okay. That aside, every time I look at this image here, I can't help but wonder, what the hell is this thing over here going toward this guy's mouth? I will leave that for y'all to decide. All right. Another pretty cool example of the Columbian exchange is the impact that horses had on the lifestyle of indigenous Americans. So, if I ask you, by the way, about the impact of Spanish colonization on Native American society, this is definitely something you'd want to include. All right. Maybe make a note of that. All European nations will bring horses to some extent, but the Spanish were the first to really bring large numbers of horses, and they greatly transformed the way of life for indigenous peoples. All right. So if we look to groups like the Comanches, for example, remember the Comanches I have suggested were this great, powerful nation who were arguably an empire of a sort. But we need to understand the Comanches had originally been a very weak people. Okay. They were an offshoot of an indigenous nation known as the Shoshones, and they'd been kicked out of their homelands, all right? And they'd been kind of pushed all around. They made their way down to the Southwest, and they said, here we're going to rebuild ourselves as a new people, all right? And by the time they arrived in the Southwest, the Spanish had been colonizing in the region, and they found some Spanish horses and learned how to incorporate them into their lifestyle. And it's really through their expert use of horses that the Comanches were able to build themselves up into such a powerful empire, all right? They were able to use some horses for things like trading, using them as commodities. They used other horses for warfare and for raiding, through which they could get more goods and in some cases even more horses. Horses were very transformative to the way of life for indigenous peoples, also making it much easier for them to hunt, providing more food and creating a more sustainable way of life for many of them. So I guess it's a pretty good overview of the Columbian exchange. Shows us some clear examples here of things being brought to the new world, being sent to the old world, and how it's completely transforming the way of life for certain peoples on both sides of the world. Okay. But the other impact of Columbus's voyages, I suggested, was that it would lead to further European exploration and colonization. So first off, Columbus himself would be sent on for further voyages. He was sent on 4 voyages total, and in the process, he kidnapped and enslaved numerous Native American peoples. The peoples he encountered here were referred to as the Taino. That's Taino. He did his best to make them Spanish subjects by enslaving them, and he was constantly hounding them, trying to find where's the gold, where's the valuable stuff. And he exploited as many resources as he could here throughout these 4 voyages. And this is 4 voyages that helped them realize that somewhere across the water here, there were these great empires who had all this great wealth. That, of course, would be groups like the Aztecs and the Incas. Remember, the Aztecs were living in Mexico. They were under this great empire that was extracting wealth from all the surrounding areas, collecting tribute, in the forms of food, labor, and even human subjects to sometimes used for things like human sacrifice. So while they were thriving economically, the social order of their empire was not doing so well. Their emperor, Montezuma II, was losing a lot of popularity among his subjects for all this tribute he was demanding and for sacrificing individuals who he was ruling over as well. And there was a Spanish conquistador named Hernan Cortez. The word conquistador is Spanish for conqueror, and that's exactly what it is. Okay, these are individuals who would go conquer native peoples, take over their territory, exploit their resources, do so in the name of the Spanish crown. So Cortez was ready to carry out this expedition against the people of Mexico. He didn't know exactly what he was going to find there, but he was hoping to find great riches. He got his ships all packed up. He had his guys ready to go. He had his weapons and horses ready to go. And then he got orders from some Spanish authorities saying, don't go through with this. We're actually sending somebody else to do it instead. The governor of Cuba, where he was launching out of, doesn't want you doing this. We're going to have somebody else go instead. Cortez was pretty irritated with that. He looked around. He said, you know what? I got my guys ready to go. We're all packed up. I'm going to go ask for forgiveness after the fact. All right. He went ahead and went through with it anyway. His logic was, well, once I go, I'm going to find great wealth. I'm going to extract that great wealth. I'm going to conquer whoever I have to get that great wealth. And from there, I'll have all this wealth to offer to the king and queen of Spain. They're going to want to keep me around. All right. They're going to realize that I did this successfully and I'll be in their good graces. Now, they may be pissed at me in the meantime, but that just means I got to work quickly. So he sailed on to Mexico, started working his way to the Aztec capital. And as he was doing so, he was facing some serious disadvantages, all right? He was greatly outnumbered. He just had a few guys with him in this great empire. He's unfamiliar with the area. And throughout this conquest, once he kind of got it started, he got distracted by having to go fight with another conquistador, a guy named Pedro de Narvaez. That's who the Spanish authorities were actually going to send to carry out the conquest of Mexico instead of Cortez. All right. So when he found out that Cortez had gone through with this conquest, he was pretty upset, and he headed to Mexico to try to arrest him. So as Cortez is in the middle of trying to conquer the Aztec Empire, he had to go fight Narvaez and end up poking his eye out in the process. Point I'm getting at is he had all kinds of things stacked against him, making it seem very unlikely that he would be able to carry through this conquest. However, he was successful. He managed to conquer the Aztec Empire. He basically destroyed the great city of Tenochtitlan, which remember was their capital. And he built Mexico City quite literally on top of the ruins of Tenochtitlan. So if you've ever been to Mexico City, you were standing on the ruins of Tenochtitlan. And sure enough, after taking over the Aztec Empire and extracting all their wealth, Cortez made it clear to the king and queen of Spain that he was still their guy as long as they supported him. So they allowed him to stay there as governor, and they collected all kinds of tribute from him. And they were very glad to have access to all the wealth and resources that Cortez had helped them acquire here, just as he had hoped. But we got to think here, how was Cortez able to do this, right? I just showed us he had some serious disadvantages stacked against him, and he's getting distracted going and fighting another battle in the middle of all this. How was he able to conquer such a powerful, wealthy, skilled empire? Some of you may be thinking, oh, well, he had metal, he had swords, he had guns and horses. Those things probably helped somewhat, but look, we're fighting close hand-to-hand combat. Things like horses and guns aren't really going to be so helpful. I'm sure the metal, having that armor, metal weapons, was probably very helpful as well. But I'm going to suggest that there were two major advantages that Cortez had that made this conquest possible. So one major advantage he had was support from indigenous peoples throughout Mexico. A great example is Doña Marina, or La Malinche, as she's sometimes referred to. This was a native woman who was given up to Cortez by some of the people of Mexico to help him out. They ended up forming some kind of a sexual relationship. It's not clear whether that was consensual or if it was kind of forced upon her. But regardless, they had some kind of relationship there, and she acted as a translator and a guide for Cortez. All right, so she kind of helped guide him around Mexico, helped him communicate with native peoples, and helped him find his way to the capital. She was crucial to his success. All right. Doña Marina and Cortez ended up even having a son together, and their child kind of symbolized the birth of the mestizo people, meaning the Mexican people who would be a mix of both indigenous and Spanish ancestry. And as a result of all this, Doña Marina, or La Malinche, as she's commonly referred to, has a mixed legacy in history and in legend. Some people look at her as the great mother of Mexico, right? She uh, gave birth to the first modern Mexican child. Others see her as a great trader who sold out the indigenous peoples of Mexico to the European colonizers. Very fascinating woman. So we can see that she's pretty historically significant because she's a clear example of European dependence on Native American support in colonial America. All right. So if you were asked, for example, on an exam, you wouldn't want to come up with some random reason or find something on Google. You would want to know that Doña Marina was historically significant because she's an example of European dependence on indigenous people's support in colonial America. Cortez was also able to take advantage of the fact that so many of the people who the Aztecs had conquered greatly resented them, largely because they were having to pay high tribute and give people up for human sacrifice. They didn't really care for the Emperor Montezuma. So a lot of the people in surrounding areas, when they heard that Cortez was here to conquer the great empire and then Tenochtitlan, came to his assistance, all right? And it's the support of these native peoples fighting alongside Cortez that helped him grow his numbers. Definitely played a key role in helping him topple the Aztec Empire. Much to their dismay, they would find later down the road that Cortez was just going to kind of replace the empire ruling out of Tenochtitlan, and his empire would be a bit more brutal and still demand tribute from the native people, and definitely do things like demand harsh labor out of them. Second major advantage Cortez had that helped him defeat the Aztecs was European diseases, okay, things like smallpox. Cortez and his guys had been in Tenochtitlan for quite some time. Where they carried through with the official conquest, it was kind of a gradual process. For a while, they held Montezuma hostage and hung out in the capital and ruled by proxy. And during all that time, a lot of their diseases were spreading throughout Tenochtitlan. Remember, they had grown immune to those diseases, most of them by this point, but these native peoples had never been exposed to those diseases. So a lot of native people began to die off, and a lot of their social networks were individuals who would care for the sick began to die off as well, greatly weakening the Aztec population. All right, so Cortez had people dying of disease, and he had a bunch of native people coming to back him up. Those are the two key ways that he was able to conquer this great empire in Mexico City. It wasn't because he was also superior. He had support from native people and from Mother Nature here. All right, and this is a pretty brutal conquest. How did Cortez justify just coming in and destroying this civilization, taking over, and establishing a new empire in this region? Well, a lot of it had to do with Aztec practices of human sacrifice. So I'm going to go ahead and read to you an account that Cortez had about Aztec human sacrifice, which he would use to justify his conquest of the Aztecs. They have another custom, horrible and abominable, deserving punishment, in which we have never before seen in any other place. And it is this, that as often as they have anything to ask of their idols, in order that their petition may be more acceptable, they take boys or girls, and even grown men and women, and in the presence of those idols, they open their breasts while they are alive, and take out their hearts and entrails, and burn the said entrails and hearts before the idols, offering that smoke and sacrifice to them. Some of us who have seen this say that it seems the most terrible and frightening thing to behold that has ever been seen. So frequently and so often do these Indians do this, according to our information, and partly by what we have seen in the short time that we are in this country, that no year passes in which they do not kill and sacrifice 50 souls in each mosque. Your majesties may rest assured that, according to the seas of the land, which to us seems very considerable, and the many mosques which they have, there's no year, as far as we have until now discovered and seen, when they do not kill and sacrifice in this manner some 3,000 to 4,000 souls. Now let your royal highness consider if they ought not prevent so great an evil, a crime, and certainly God, our Lord, will be pleased if, through the command of your royal highness, these people should be initiated and instructed in our very holy Catholic faith. All right, so there's some real issues going on here, though, with Cortez's justification. Number one, he's referring multiple times to these Aztec temples as mosques. I'm guessing the reason he did that is a legacy of things like the Reconquista, where Europeans had this fight. They were fighting against occupying Islamic forces, and the place of worship in the Muslim faith is referred to as a mosque. These are much different types of worship centers that the Aztecs have, but because they're different than what Cortez has seen in his type of Catholic church, he's referring to them as a mosque, giving them that same kind of connotation that they're the antithesis of what he's used to as a place of worship. Furthermore, on one hand, here he says, there's no year passes that they do not kill or sacrifice, rather, 50 souls in each mosque. All right. And then later down the road here, just a sentence or two later, he says, there is no year, as far as we can tell, when they do not kill and sacrifice in this manner some 3,000 or 4,000 souls. So what is it, 50 or 3,000 to 4,000? That's a pretty big difference there. Okay. And then he's justifying this last statement here, saying, let us carry through with this conquest. Our God will be pleased. So essentially saying he's willing to kill these people to please his own God. So if the problem is that they're doing this brutal murder to please their gods, is coming in and slaughtering them in order to please his own God really any different? And that leads into the Aztecs' perspective on this conquest, okay? So what we see here is a drawing of an individual who witnessed this firsthand. These individuals here with these tunics are Aztec priests and holy men. These individuals with the armor and the spears and the swords are all Spanish soldiers. So we can see that according to this artist, the Spanish soldiers were dismembering Aztec body parts, having their entrails coming out, doing a lot of the same things that the Spanish were using as excuses to justify coming in and conquering the Aztecs. So is there really a justification if they're carrying out the exact same actions and justifying doing so by saying we're spreading our holy Catholic faith to these people, when the only reason the Aztecs were doing those types of things were to please their gods and to honor their religion? Just keep all that in mind. That, again, this shows us the essence of considering multiple perspectives and really scrutinizing the sources that we base our history off of. Not long after Cortez's conquest of the Aztecs in Mexico, another Spanish conquistador named Francisco Pizarro led a conquest against the Incas in Peru. Very brutal conquest and very similar in many ways to Cortez's conquest of the Aztecs. Pizarro depended very heavily on the same things that Cortez did in order to have success here against this mighty empire. All right. Definitely got a lot of support from conquered peoples and also depended heavily on the spread of disease by the time they had reached their capital city and were able to come in and take over. Okay, so we can see the conquest of the Aztecs and Incas led to Spain obtaining great wealth. All right, they gained control of all kinds of valuable resources, as well as thousands of individuals who they would now use as human subjects. So, they would get these subjects, meaning the people who they had now conquered and brought under their domain within these empires, to pay them all kinds of tribute, not only through resources, but also through harsh labor. And the Spanish Empire was built largely on the backs of conquered indigenous peoples. And a lot of the great wealth, things such as silver that the Spanish benefited from in the Americas, was made possible by the forced labor of indigenous peoples as well. They established a colony here in Mexico, which they referred to as New Spain. They also had a colony here in Peru now, and they would continue to expand and continue to colonize. And the reason they're doing so is they're looking for more riches, okay? They're constantly looking for a new Mexico or a new Peru, trying to see the same kind of wealth they found here by exploring into other parts of North America. Now, unfortunately for them, while they will find some benefits in some areas outside of Mexico and Peru, they really hit the sweet spots in their early colonization efforts of Mexico and down into Central and South America. These are going to be the most valuable colonies they're going to have. However, all the wealth that they're attaining from here with things like silver would eventually end up crippling the Spanish economy because it would lead to massive inflation. But the point I'm getting at here is this great wealth in these colonies led them to continue to colonize further into North and South America. And they weren't alone. Once people started getting word that the Spanish were here extracting all this great wealth, everybody and their mother came in. All right, we had the English coming in, the Dutch, the Swedish, the Russians up in here had a small little bit of wealth coming in from the fur trade in the Northwest. The French would come in as well. I don't know why they're not shown on this map, but the Portuguese had some influence down here in South America. Everybody was exploiting riches from the Caribbean as well, which is strangely not shown on this map. Point we can see, though, is that Spain's success in colonization would lead to all kinds of European empires coming in and now competing to carve out a piece of the pie here in North America. All right, guys, this is it for this lecture. We have now seen the fortunate misfortunes of Christopher Columbus, the Columbian Exchange, and its impacts on further European colonization. If you have any questions on this, let me know. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and end this here for now. Over and out.